She humiliated us, targeted my disabled dad, and tried to rip apart the one safe place we had left, our home. Watching her power trip unfold while my father trembled in fear broke something in me. The helplessness, the injustice, it was enough to make my blood boil. She didn't just cross a line, she shattered it. The name's Daniel, and all I wanted that day was peace, just a quiet moment after a brutal morning at the hospital with my father. He's a tough old veteran, but even steel bends under pressure, and these treatments had worn him down to a whisper of himself. I was exhausted too, physically and emotionally. As I eased our black sedan into the driveway, my only goal was to get Dad inside so he could rest. But of course, peace is a foreign concept in our neighborhood, at least when Karen's watching. Karen Mila, our HOA president, was already waiting like a vulture in heels, arms crossed, lips pursed, HOA violation pamphlet clutched like a Bible. The moment our tires kissed the concrete, her smile curled like smoke. I didn't know it yet, but that driveway showdown was just the beginning. And me? I'm not a fighter by nature. I'm the guy who holds the door open, apologizes when someone else bumps into me. But there comes a point when even the quiet ones stop turning the other cheek. That day, I was just a son trying to protect his dad. By the end, I'd become something else entirely. Thanks to Karen, I was ready for war. The moment I opened the trunk to grab my father's wheelchair, I heard her. That voice, sharp, smug, slicing through the humid afternoon like a rusty blade. That vehicle is in violation of HOA regulations, Karen declared, as if she were delivering a sentence in a courtroom drama instead of harassing a man trying to help his disabled father into the house. I paused, already feeling the familiar wave of irritation rising, but this time it wasn't just annoyance. It was deeper. Hotter. I turned to face her, trying to keep my voice level. Karen, it's a black sedan. Not a delivery truck. Not a food van. Just a car. I gestured to my dad, still pale from hours in a hospital chair. We just got back from treatment. Can't this wait? But Karen, with her laminated HOA booklet clutched to her chest like it was sacred scripture, shook her head with theatrical solemnity. Page 17, paragraph 3b. Vehicles used for any non-residential function can be subject to immediate removal. I felt my jaw tighten. My hands curled into fists at my sides. My father, who could barely stand, gripped the car door, his face caught between confusion and shame. And Karen? She was just getting started. Tow truck's on its way, she added with a smile that made my skin crawl. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She'd already called for a tow. Without even knocking on the door. Without giving us a single chance to explain or comply. I felt something ignite in my chest. This wasn't policy enforcement. This was cruelty wrapped in red tape. Frustration boiled into outrage as the distant rumble of a tow truck grew louder, vibrating through the soles of my shoes. My father whispered, "Maybe I can walk a bit farther if it helps." "No," I said, turning back to Karen with a quiet fury I hadn't known I could muster. "You've crossed a line today." And in that moment, I made a silent promise, she would regret it. The tow truck groaned to a halt in front of our driveway like some mechanical beast summoned by Karen's twisted will. Its flashing amber lights reflected off every polished mailbox on the block, drawing eyes, drawing whispers. My father sat quietly in the passenger seat, hands trembling in his lap, his pallor grayer than it had been even in the hospital. This wasn't just harassment, it was public humiliation. The driver stepped out, clipboard in hand, all business and zero empathy. "Which one?" he asked, his voice flat. "That one," Karen said with theatrical flourish, pointing to our black sedan like a schoolteacher tattling on a misbehaving student. "Hook it up." I stepped forward, chest tight. "You're making a mistake." The tow truck driver gave me a glance, one eyebrow raised. "You the owner?" "No. My wife is," I said, steady but firm. "And you really don't want to tow this vehicle?" Karen scoffed, practically vibrating with anticipation. Oh, here we go again. Another sob story. What's next? You're going to say it's a government vehicle. I didn't blink. It is. The tow driver froze, pen halfway to the form. Wait, what? Karen rolled her eyes so hard it looked like a tick. Oh, please. There are no police cars in this neighborhood. Karen, I said, my voice lowering into something that made even the tow driver's eyes widen. Think carefully. That's a sworn law enforcement vehicle. Tampering with it could land you in court. She laughed, but it was thinner now, more brittle. Then show me the badge. And right on cue, my wife Scarlett pulled into the driveway, stepping out like a storm in heels. She didn't say a word. Just walked over, flipped open her wallet, and flashed her badge under the sun. Silence. Karen's smirk vanished like smoke in wind. The tow truck driver took a step back, suddenly treating the car like it might explode. Ma'am, he said to Scarlett, I'm very sorry. I didn't know. You weren't told the truth, she replied coolly, her eyes locked on Karen. Karen sputtered, trying to shift blame. He didn't tell me. He said. I said enough, I cut in. And you ignored me. The neighbors had started gathering by now, whispering, filming. Karen had drawn them in hoping to shame us, but she'd only shamed herself. And somehow, I knew, this was just the beginning. Something changed in the air the moment Karen backed off, if only temporarily. It wasn't surrender. It was strategy. The look she gave us as she turned and stalked down the sidewalk wasn't defeat. It was calculation. And I knew then, deep in my bones, that she wasn't done. That woman was regrouping. Plotting. Over the next 2 days, the neighborhood felt too quiet. Unsettlingly so. The violation notices stopped appearing overnight, and no ridiculous emails filled our inbox. But instead of relief, I felt a slow, crawling dread. Karen didn't let things go. She waited. She planned. Scarlett noticed it too. She's setting something up, she said one evening as we sat on the porch, watching shadows stretch across the perfect hedges and pristine driveways. This silence. It's not peace. It's prelude. Then came the envelopes. 3 of them, all in red. No return address. No explanation. Each one slipped into our mailbox at different times of day. One early in the morning, one mid-afternoon, one late at night. I knew because I'd been watching. Waiting. The first envelope had a photo, our sedan, parked in the driveway. A big red circle drawn around the license plate. No message, just the image. The second contained a printed copy of the HOA bylaws, with 3 clauses underlined in neon pink, all referencing unauthorized vehicle presence, property, aesthetic consistency, and something absurd about non-conforming ramp structures. The third held nothing but a single typed sentence, your time is running out. Scarlett stood over the kitchen table staring at the pile, her jaw clenched. She's escalating. And just like that, the anticipation that had hung thick for days snapped into something more tangible, a threat. We knew Karen had crossed lines before, but this was different. This was deliberate. Creeping. Dad sat in the next room, unaware of the ominous notes, but his exhaustion was deeper this week. I couldn't let him be dragged further into this. Karen was preparing her next move, and I had no doubt it would be crueler than the last. We just didn't know how far she'd go, yet. The next blow didn't come with a knock or a letter, it came in the form of a gut-punching realization. I was helping my dad onto the porch for his afternoon breath of fresh air, the kind of small routine that had become sacred in the wake of everything, when I spotted it. A city inspector. Clipboard in hand, official seal on his jacket, and confusion painted across his face. Can I help you? I asked, already bracing. He looked up, polite but firm. I received a complaint about unauthorized construction on this property. Something about a non-permitted accessibility ramp. Scarlett, standing just behind the screen door, let out a quiet curse under her breath. My stomach twisted. You've got to be kidding me. That ramp is for my father. He's a disabled veteran. It's not some luxury feature, it's a lifeline. The inspector hesitated. Sir, I understand. But I have to follow up on formal HOA reports. Of course. Karen. Dad shifted uncomfortably in his chair beside me. His hands tightened on the armrests. Son, if it's causing trouble, I can manage the stairs again. I'll try. That broke me. The fact that he even felt responsible for this circus. I turned to the inspector, fire in my chest now. You're not taking that ramp down. You'll need a court order, and even then, I'll fight you every step of the way. This isn't about property values. This is about dignity. The inspector nodded slowly, perhaps seeing just how much we'd already endured. I'll file a report. But I'll make note of the medical necessity. As he walked away, I saw Karen watching from her yard, sipping her iced tea like it was sweet victory. But I didn't look away. Not this time. Let her know I saw her. Let her know I was done playing defense. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops of West Pine Estates and bathed our neighborhood in a deceptively peaceful glow, I sat at the kitchen table with Scarlett and my father, surrounded by a mountain of violation letters, receipts, photos, and screenshots. But this time, the mess didn't feel overwhelming. It felt like evidence, ammunition. Scarlett had spent hours cross-referencing each complaint with ADA guidelines and state statutes. Every false fine Karen had issued, every threat she'd scribbled on those laminated violation slips, we logged it. Not just for our case, but for everyone else she'd steamrolled. This is no longer about us, I said, holding up one of Karen's letters like a surgeon presenting a tumor. This is about power abused and justice ignored. Scarlett nodded. It's time we stop asking for peace and start demanding accountability. Dad, whose voice had grown quieter over the weeks, leaned forward. Then let's do it right. Not just with noise, but with truth. The next day, I walked into the city's Housing and Civil Rights office with a binder so thick it looked like a legal weapon. And it was. Inside were sworn statements from neighbors, photos of unauthorized ramps and swing sets, emails from Karen threatening residents over mailbox colors. We had a statement from a disabled veteran denied ramp accommodations, a mother fined for a baby stroller left briefly on her porch, and yes, we had the incident reports from both times Karen tried to illegally tow Scarlett's unmarked police vehicle. The intake officer, a man named Jaron, flipped through the binder silently for nearly 10 minutes. Then he looked up at me with an expression I hadn't seen in weeks, one that said, "You're not crazy, and you're not alone." "This isn't an HOA conflict," he said finally, setting the binder down with purpose. "This is systemic abuse. And it's actionable." Those two words, "it's actionable," rang like a starter's pistol in my soul. Within days, an official investigation was launched. Karen wasn't notified yet, but we could already feel the tides shifting. Anonymous tip lines were set up. Residents began submitting their own documentation. And behind the scenes, Scarlett coordinated with a local disability rights attorney. This wasn't just pushback. It was organized resistance. The reign of Karen's laminated tyranny had gone on long enough. Now, she was about to learn what real accountability looks like. The ripple effect was more powerful than I ever expected. Once word spread that a formal investigation was underway, our once quiet neighborhood erupted with whispered conversations, cautious optimism, and, for the first time in years, a flicker of collective courage. One by one, neighbors started coming forward. They knocked on our door or caught me by the mailbox. Some came with trembling voices, clutching envelopes they'd been too afraid to speak about. Others arrived with binders of their own, ready to add fuel to the growing fire against Karen. There was the elderly couple on Birch Lane who had been fined weekly for their non-compliant flower beds, vibrant, life-filled blooms that had brought joy to the block. There was Selena, a single mom who revealed she'd paid Karen in cash to keep her child's swing set from being reviewed by compliance. And then there was Henry, a local veteran who quietly handed me a faded photo of his late wife sitting on the porch. Karen forced him to repaint 3 x 4 shade inconsistencies. We documented everything. Scarlett built an encrypted digital archive while I conducted interviews in our living room. The stories were raw, painful, and laced with years of silence and fear. But together, they were becoming something powerful, undeniable proof of widespread misconduct. Karen had ruled through isolation, shaming one neighbor at a time, banking on their silence. But now, that silence was broken. My father sat by the window each evening, watching neighbors pass and wave again. There was life coming back into this street, one conversation at a time. I always thought we were the only ones, he murmured one night, watching a couple plant flowers in defiance of HOA guidelines. No, I said. We were just the first ones loud enough to be heard. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about unity. And it was growing. The poetic justice came not with a bang, but with the unmistakable click of a camera shutter and the thunderous silence of a woman realizing her empire had crumbled. It was the day the city investigators arrived, 3 SUVs, a local police cruiser, and one determined housing authority official armed with a folder thicker than a phone book. They marched up Karen's manicured walkway like they owned the place. In a way, they did. Karen, of course, met them at the door in her usual red power blazer, armed with her HOA rulebook like it was the Constitution. But this time, it was useless. I stood across the street with Scarlett and my father, watching the scene unfold. My phone buzzed with messages from neighbors. Is this it? Are they arresting her? About time. Karen's shriek, high-pitched and indignant, cut through the air as they handed her a warrant and stepped inside. Minutes later, they emerged with boxes of records, receipts, even a safe she had tried to claim, contained neighborhood blueprints. Right. The sight of that safe being wheeled out like a captured relic was oddly satisfying. And then, the final blow, the moment they escorted Karen down the front steps in handcuffs. The neighborhood, once ruled by her fearmongering and fines, stood in eerie silence. Until my father, quiet, gentle, always polite, muttered just loud enough for those nearby to hear, "She used to write me up for not trimming the hedges. Wonder if she'll get fined for missing court." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Vindication didn't need a gavel slam. It was in the relieved sighs, the triumphant smirks, the way neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now exchanged knowing glances of shared triumph. Karen had built her kingdom on intimidation and manipulation. And in the end, it wasn't a war that toppled her, it was truth, persistence, and a neighborhood finally uniting against her reign. Poetic, indeed. For days after Karen's arrest, the neighborhood buzzed like a shaken beehive. People who had once tiptoed around her started speaking openly, sharing stories with the kind of fervor you'd expect at a courtroom drama binge-watch party. But me? I wasn't ready to celebrate just yet. Because as satisfying as the downfall was, I knew we were only halfway up the mountain. And that mountain was built out of paper, violation letters, receipts, questionable financial statements, and angry emails that had been ignored for years. With Scarlett's help, I transformed our dining room into a makeshift command center. Dad sat by the window, his laptop open, slowly typing out everything he remembered about Karen's antics over the past year, dates, times, witnesses. It wasn't just his story anymore, it was our community's. One by one, neighbors came by, some nervously clutching manila envelopes, others with full-on binders. They were done being afraid. Mrs. Santiago brought over a thumb drive filled with HOA meeting recordings Karen thought she had erased. Rick, 2 doors down, arrived with a USB labeled HOA Madness, Volume 1. He grinned. I always knew that woman would implode. Just figured I'd be ready when she did. Each document, each photo, each voice recording was another crack in Karen's crumbling legacy. Scarlett organized it all into a timeline, her skills as an investigator shining through in every color-coded tab and spreadsheet. We weren't just building a case for satisfaction anymore. We were aiming for systemic change. Then came the email. The city's Department of Neighborhood Oversight requested an official statement from me and any neighbors willing to speak. That was the moment it felt real. Not just Karen's downfall, but the chance to ensure no future HOA dictator could rise again. I called a neighborhood meeting, this time, not in fear, but with purpose. As we gathered in the park that weekend, the breeze carried a different kind of energy. People were smiling, laughing, sharing lemonade and stories of survival. No longer victims, but voices. For the first time, I looked around and saw a community no longer shackled by one woman's obsession with control. We weren't just documenting history. We were rewriting it. And Karen? She'd be a footnote. A warning. The HOA tyrant who underestimated the quiet man with a father in a wheelchair, and the fire his family and neighbors carried when pushed too far. The day the city released their official findings felt like Christmas, the 4th of July, and poetic justice all rolled into one. The final report confirmed what we'd all suspected: Karen had not only abused her authority, but she'd also siphoned thousands from the HOA's coffers over the years through unapproved fines, inflated maintenance contracts, and consulting fees that traced back to shell companies she controlled. The city didn't just suggest change, they recommended a full audit, a freeze on HOA enforcement powers, and Karen's permanent removal from all leadership roles. I remember standing on our front porch with my dad and Scarlett when the news hit. Scarlett was reading the statement aloud, her voice steady and firm, while Dad just kept nodding, his eyes watery but sharp. "She's done," he whispered. "She can't hurt anyone anymore." The neighborhood erupted. Rick organized a block party that same afternoon, grills fired up, folding chairs unfolded, and someone even made Karen-Free Zone t-shirts. Neighbors hugged, laughed, and swapped Karen horror stories like old war vets recounting battles. The ramp that Karen had once called an eyesore. It was now lined with potted plants and handmade signs that said, "Welcome home, Mr. Jones, in honor of my dad." That evening, someone knocked on our door. It was Lisa, Karen's old secretary. She handed me a thick folder and simply said, "I should have done this sooner." Inside were more receipts, memos, and emails that showed just how deep the corruption went. She'd risked a lot to come forward, but she smiled through her nerves. "You gave everyone the courage to stand up. Even me." It hit me then, this wasn't just about fighting Karen. It was about reclaiming the soul of our neighborhood. Triumph wasn't just in Karen's downfall. It was in the unity we found, the strength we uncovered, and the vindication we earned, together. The morning of Karen's sentencing was warm, clear, and strangely peaceful, almost like the neighborhood itself knew what was coming. I stood in front of the courthouse with my dad, Scarlett, and a small group of neighbors who had been there through it all. Some held coffee cups, others clutched folded documents, but all of us were united by the same tight knot of anticipation. Inside that courthouse, years of intimidation, gaslighting, and abuse of power were about to meet their reckoning. Karen Mila arrived in a charcoal gray suit, flanked by a lawyer who looked like he'd stepped out of a late-night infomercial. She still had that same smug set to her jaw, like she was strolling into a PDA meeting, not a federal courtroom. But her confidence began to crack the moment the prosecutor laid out the charges: abuse of power, targeted harassment, obstruction, and financial misconduct. They even had Lisa testify, her voice shaking at first, but growing stronger as she described the threats, the forged documents, the hidden accounts. You could feel the shift in the room. The facade Karen had built for years began to crumble, brick by entitled brick. And then it was my turn. I told the court what it felt like to come home from the hospital with my sick father, only to be ambushed by a tow truck. I recounted the letters, the lies, the humiliation of having to defend our dignity from someone who saw rules as weapons. I watched Karen's face carefully. She didn't smirk. She didn't sneer. She looked hollow. For once, the Queen of Crestwood Estates didn't have a single word to say. When the judge read the sentence, 18 months of house arrest, hefty fines, permanent removal from any HOA leadership, and mandatory restitution to affected families, a weight lifted off our chests. Karen didn't cry. She didn't shout. She just sat there, still as stone, her empire officially dismantled. Outside, the press swarmed, but none of us stopped for interviews. We walked past the cameras, my dad gripping my arm tightly, and Scarlett brushing a proud tear from her cheek. We didn't need a headline to validate what we felt. Karen's reign was over. And for the first time in years, our neighborhood felt like home again. They say a neighborhood is just houses until the people make it a home. And after everything we've been through, my father's health battles, the harassment, the endless violation notices, Crestwood finally felt like a community again. With Karen Mila removed, something extraordinary happened. People came out of hiding. Porches once shuttered with blinds now had neighbors waving from rocking chairs. Kids rode their bikes freely without fear of being fined for excessive noise. For the first time, I could see it, the warmth, the unity, the potential. It started with Mrs. Santiago organizing a Saturday block brunch. No permits. No Karen. Just folding tables, mismatched chairs, and the smell of homemade empanadas. My father, who hadn't smiled that wide in months, rolled down the ramp, still proudly unpainted and unapproved, and was met with applause. Someone even brought him a slice of tres leches before he'd settled in. People laughed. Shared stories. Compared their Karen moments with that bittersweet camaraderie survivors carry. Scarlett helped design a neighborhood bulletin board, replacing Karen's rule-bound memos with birthday shout-outs and community notices. Rick donated his grill for a weekend cookout. Even Lisa, once Karen's right hand, came by with lemon bars and an apology, and she stayed. By the time the sun dipped below the rooftops that night, lights twinkled from lawn stringers, music floated from someone's speaker, and people lingered. Not as isolated homeowners, but as a family, bonded not by proximity, but by shared resilience. We'd faced a tyrant in a power suit and won, not with rage, but with unity, truth, and just the right amount of quiet defiance. Crestwood had been reborn. Not because of new rules, but because the right people finally took their place at the heart of it. Together.